Hello there, and welcome to Cosmic Slumber. Tonight we are drifting into one of the most ordinary, most overlooked things the human body does every single day, the simple, quiet act of yawning. Most people assume it means nothing more than tiredness or boredom, a small, forgettable reflex barely worth a second thought. But researchers who study yawning closely have found something far stranger underneath. It may be a way of cooling the brain. It may be tied closely to empathy and social bonding. It begins before birth, inside the womb, long before there is anything to be tired of at all. It spreads from person to person almost like a whispered suggestion passed silently through a room. The closer scientists look at this small, universal gesture, the less ordinary it becomes. This is not medical advice, simply a calm, gentle tour through the quiet science of something the body does almost without us ever noticing. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps other sleepy minds find their way here, too, one quiet breath at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your thoughts settle slowly, like a long, slow breath finally released, as we drift through the surprising story of why we yawn. Let's begin. Yawning is not primarily caused by a lack of oxygen, despite this being one of the most widely believed explanations. For many years, people assumed yawning happened simply because the body needed more oxygen or wanted to expel excess carbon dioxide. Later research testing this idea directly found that changing the oxygen or carbon dioxide levels a person breathes does not reliably increase or decrease how often they yawn, quietly undermining one of the oldest and most commonly repeated explanations for the behavior. One of the leading modern theories suggests yawning may help cool the brain. According to what researchers sometimes call the thermoregulatory theory, the deep inhale and stretched jaw involved in a yawn may increase blood flow and airflow in ways that help lower brain temperature slightly, particularly when the brain has become a little warmer than ideal, offering the body a small, built-in cooling mechanism triggered automatically without any conscious thought at all. Yawning tends to happen more frequently when the surrounding air temperature is closer to body temperature, rather than distinctly cooler. Researchers testing the brain cooling theory found that people were somewhat more likely to yawn in moderate outdoor temperatures compared to very cold conditions, since cold air may already help cool the brain effectively on its own, reducing the apparent need for a yawn to help with that particular cooling function. Yawning becomes noticeably less frequent in extremely cold conditions, according to some outdoor observational studies. Because cold air already carries heat away from the body relatively efficiently, some research conducted in genuinely frigid outdoor conditions found people yawned considerably less often compared to milder weather, lending further support to the idea that yawning may be functioning, at least in part, as a subtle brain cooling mechanism. A yawn typically brings a large rush of air into the mouth and lungs, along with a corresponding stretch of the jaw muscles. This combination of deep inhalation and jaw stretching is believed to increase blood flow around the face and skull, potentially assisting with the brain cooling process some researchers believe underlies the entire behavior, turning what looks like an idle habit into a small, quietly functional physiological event. Yawning appears to begin surprisingly early in human development, occurring even before birth. Ultrasound imaging has captured fetuses yawning while still inside the womb, sometimes as early as the second trimester of pregnancy, long before there is any possibility of feeling tired, bored, or sleepy in the way people typically associate with the behavior later in life. Fetal yawning may play a role in early brain and muscle development, rather than reflecting tiredness at all. Because a developing fetus obviously cannot experience tiredness or boredom in any conventional sense, researchers studying fetal yawning generally believe the behavior likely serves a very different, developmental purpose, potentially helping stimulate developing jaw muscles or contributing to healthy early brain development during this crucial prenatal period. Yawning is not unique to humans, and appears across a remarkably wide range of animal species. From dogs and cats to birds, fish, and reptiles, yawning has been documented across an unusually broad swath of the animal kingdom, suggesting the underlying behavior likely evolved very early in the history of vertebrate life, long before humans, or even mammals more broadly, first appeared. Fish have been observed yawning, despite breathing underwater in an environment quite different from land-dwelling animals. Even certain fish species display a yawn-like gaping behavior, opening their mouths wide in a manner visually similar to yawning seen in land animals, suggesting the underlying reflex may be tied to something more fundamental than simply managing airflow through lungs the way mammals do. Snakes yawn as well, sometimes specifically to help reposition their jaw after consuming unusually large prey. While snake yawning likely serves a somewhat different, more mechanical purpose compared to yawning in mammals, the visible gesture, a wide, deliberate opening of the jaw, looks strikingly similar, another example of how widespread this general jaw-opening behavior appears to be across a wide range of very different animal species. Yawning in animals is sometimes associated with transitions between different behavioral states, such as moving from rest into activity. Researchers studying yawning across various species have noted it frequently occurs around transitional moments, such as waking up, preparing to become active, or settling down to rest, suggesting yawning may help signal or support a shift between different physiological or behavioral states more broadly. Yawning is contagious among humans, meaning simply seeing, hearing, or even reading about someone yawning can trigger a yawn of your own. This well-documented phenomenon, sometimes called contagious yawning, has fascinated researchers for decades, and remarkably, even reading a detailed description of yawning, much like this very sentence, has been shown in studies to reliably trigger yawning in a meaningful percentage of people encountering it. Contagious yawning appears to be closely linked to empathy and social bonding. Several studies have found that people who score higher on measures of empathy tend to be somewhat more susceptible to contagious yawning, suggesting the behavior may be tied to broader social and emotional processes within the brain, rather than functioning as a purely physical, mechanical reflex entirely disconnected from social context. People are generally more likely to catch a yawn from someone they know well, such as a close friend or family member, compared to a complete stranger. Research into contagious yawning has found that social closeness appears to influence how easily a yawn spreads from one person to another, with yawns passing more readily between people who share an existing close relationship, compared to interactions between individuals who are relatively unfamiliar with one another. Contagious yawning has also been observed in several non-human animal species, including dogs, chimpanzees, and wolves. Beyond humans, researchers have documented contagious yawning occurring within various social animal species, sometimes even across species lines, such as dogs yawning in apparent response to a yawning human, suggesting the underlying social or empathetic mechanism behind contagious yawning may not be entirely unique to humans alone. Dogs have been observed yawning in response to yawns from their owner specifically, more so than from unfamiliar people. Some studies exploring cross-species contagious yawning have found dogs were more likely to yawn in response to a yawn from their own familiar owner, compared to a stranger, echoing the same general familiarity-based pattern researchers have observed within purely human contagious yawning studies as well. Young children generally do not display strong contagious yawning until they reach a certain stage of social and emotional development. Research suggests that susceptibility to contagious yawning tends to increase gradually as children grow older, becoming considerably more pronounced by around 4 or 5 years of age, roughly coinciding with broader developmental milestones related to empathy and social understanding more generally. Some research suggests individuals with certain neurodevelopmental differences may show reduced susceptibility to contagious yawning, though findings in this area remain genuinely mixed. A number of studies have explored whether certain neurodevelopmental conditions correlate with reduced contagious yawning, given the behavior's apparent link to social and empathetic processing, though results across different individual studies have been inconsistent enough that researchers continue to treat this particular area with appropriate scientific caution. Yawning tends to increase noticeably in frequency during the hour or so before typical bedtime. As part of the body's natural preparation for sleep, yawning frequency often rises in the evening hours, potentially reflecting subtle shifts in body temperature, arousal level, or brain activity associated with the body's broader transition toward rest, offering one small, familiar signal among the many subtle changes accompanying the approach of sleep. Yawning also tends to increase shortly after waking up in the morning, alongside the more commonly recognized evening pattern. Rather than occurring only when someone feels sleepy and tired, yawning also frequently increases shortly after waking, potentially reflecting the body's transition out of sleep and back into a more alert, active state, further reinforcing the idea that yawning may be more closely tied to shifting arousal states than to simple tiredness alone. A single yawn typically lasts only a few seconds, yet involves a surprisingly coordinated sequence of muscular movements. Despite feeling like a simple, almost involuntary reflex, a yawn actually involves a fairly complex, coordinated sequence of muscle movements across the jaw, throat, and chest, unfolding within just a few brief seconds, a small but genuinely intricate physiological event most people never consciously notice happening. The urge to yawn can sometimes be consciously suppressed, though many people find this surprisingly difficult or uncomfortable to do. While it is generally possible to consciously resist the urge to yawn, at least temporarily, many people describe this suppression as genuinely uncomfortable, similar in some ways to holding back a sneeze, suggesting the underlying urge reflects a fairly strong, automatic physiological drive rather than a purely optional behavior. Yawning is regulated in part by specific regions of the brain associated with automatic, largely involuntary physiological functions. Researchers studying brain activity during yawning have identified involvement from brain regions associated with automatic bodily regulation, rather than areas primarily responsible for conscious, deliberate decision-making, further supporting the general understanding of yawning as a largely automatic, reflexive behavior rather than an intentional one. Excessive yawning, occurring considerably more frequently than typical, can sometimes be associated with an underlying medical condition and may be worth discussing with a doctor. While occasional yawning throughout the day is entirely normal and expected, A sudden, persistent increase in yawning frequency without an obvious explanation, such as poor sleep or boredom, is sometimes worth mentioning to a healthcare provider, since it can occasionally be associated with various underlying health considerations. Certain medications have been associated with changes in yawning frequency as a documented side effect in some individuals. Some medications, including certain types affecting neurotransmitter activity within the brain, have been associated with increased yawning frequency as a reported side effect for some people, an interesting reminder of just how closely yawning appears to be tied to underlying brain chemistry and neurological activity more broadly. Yawning may serve a role in increasing overall alertness, rather than simply signaling tiredness on its own. Some researchers propose that yawning may actually function partly as a way of boosting alertness, temporarily increasing heart rate, blood flow, and overall arousal, meaning a yawn might represent the body's own built-in attempt to counteract fatigue, rather than simply announcing that fatigue has already fully taken hold. A yawn can cause a brief, measurable increase in heart rate immediately afterward. Physiological studies measuring heart rate during and after yawning have documented a small, temporary increase immediately following the yawn itself, consistent with the idea that yawning may help boost short-term physiological alertness, rather than functioning purely as a passive signal of accumulated tiredness. Some researchers believe yawning may help redistribute oxygen-rich blood more efficiently throughout the brain, supporting the broader brain cooling and alertness theories. Because yawning involves a deep inhale alongside increased blood flow to the head and face, some researchers suggest this combination may help support more efficient oxygen and nutrient delivery to the brain during the brief window immediately surrounding the yawn itself. Yawning frequency generally tends to decrease somewhat with advancing age. Some studies comparing yawning frequency across different age groups have found that older adults tend to yawn somewhat less frequently on average compared to younger adults and children, though the underlying reasons behind this particular age-related pattern remain an area of ongoing, still incompletely understood scientific investigation. Newborn babies yawn frequently, even though the social and empathetic aspects associated with contagious yawning in older individuals have not yet developed. Because contagious yawning tied to empathy generally develops later in childhood, yawning observed in very young infants is understood to reflect other underlying physiological functions entirely, rather than any form of social or empathetic response to yawning observed in others nearby. Yawning frequency can sometimes increase during periods of significant stress, alongside its more commonly recognized connection to tiredness. Some research and anecdotal clinical observation suggests yawning may become somewhat more frequent during periods of heightened stress or anxiety in some individuals, potentially reflecting the body's broader physiological response to stress, though this particular relationship remains less thoroughly studied compared to yawning's connection to sleep and tiredness. Some athletes report yawning noticeably more often shortly before an important competition or performance, despite not feeling tired at all. This pattern, sometimes informally described as pre-performance yawning, has led some researchers to further support the idea that yawning may relate more closely to a shift in overall arousal state, potentially helping the body prepare for an upcoming period of increased physical or mental demand, rather than reflecting fatigue in any conventional sense. Yawning can occur in clusters, with several yawns happening in relatively quick succession rather than as a single, isolated event. Many people naturally experience yawning in short clusters, producing several yawns within a brief span of a few minutes rather than just one isolated yawn, a pattern some researchers believe may reflect a more sustained underlying physiological process rather than a single, momentary trigger. The exact evolutionary origin of yawning remains somewhat uncertain, despite its presence across such a remarkably wide range of animal species. Because yawning appears so broadly across vertebrate life, researchers generally believe the behavior likely evolved quite early in evolutionary history, though pinpointing the precise original evolutionary function, and how that function may have shifted or expanded across different species over time, remains a genuinely complex and still unresolved area of ongoing scientific study. Some researchers propose that yawning may have originally evolved as a way to help synchronize group behavior among social animals. According to one proposed theory, contagious yawning observed among many social animal species may have originally helped synchronize alertness or rest periods across an entire group, potentially offering a survival advantage by helping the group collectively transition between activity and rest at roughly the same time. Group synchronization through yawning could theoretically help a group of animals remain more collectively alert to potential danger. If yawning helps synchronize periods of heightened alertness across a group, some researchers suggest this could offer a meaningful evolutionary advantage, potentially helping ensure that at least some group members remain adequately alert and watchful at any given time, rather than the entire group drifting into low alertness simultaneously and unpredictably. Yawning has been studied in relation to certain sleep disorders, given its close apparent connection to sleep-wake regulation more broadly. Because yawning frequency and patterns appear closely tied to the body's broader sleep-wake regulation systems, Researchers studying various sleep disorders have sometimes examined yawning patterns as one additional data point potentially relevant to better understanding a person's overall sleep-wake regulation and daily rhythm. A yawn is sometimes accompanied by a brief, temporary sensation affecting hearing, occasionally described as a slight popping or muffled feeling in the ears. This effect happens because yawning can briefly open the eustachian tube, a small passage connecting the middle ear to the back of the throat, momentarily equalizing air pressure in a manner similar to what happens during a plane's ascent or descent, or when swallowing deliberately to relieve ear pressure. Yawning can sometimes help relieve ear pressure discomfort during activities such as flying or driving through significant changes in altitude. Because yawning naturally opens the eustachian tube momentarily, many people find that deliberately yawning, alongside other techniques such as swallowing or chewing gum, can help relieve uncomfortable ear pressure sensations experienced during notable altitude changes, such as during airplane takeoff and landing. Some cultures throughout history have developed specific superstitions or customs surrounding yawning, often related to covering the mouth. Many cultures have historically encouraged covering the mouth while yawning, sometimes tied to various traditional beliefs regarding health, politeness, or even, in certain older folk traditions, concerns about evil spirits potentially entering the body through an open, unguarded mouth during a yawn. Yawning while covering the mouth is generally considered a matter of basic social etiquette in many modern cultural contexts today. Beyond any older superstitious origins, covering the mouth during a yawn is now widely considered simple good manners in many cultures, generally regarded as a small, considerate gesture toward others nearby, separate entirely from any of the behavior's underlying biological explanations. Yawning tends to be more socially acceptable in some cultural and professional contexts than in others. While yawning is a universal, entirely involuntary biological behavior, social expectations surrounding when and how openly it is appropriate to yawn can vary somewhat across different cultural, professional, and social settings, adding an interesting layer of social nuance on top of an otherwise purely automatic physical reflex. Some studies suggest that people who are more prone to boredom in general may also yawn somewhat more frequently throughout an average day. While tiredness remains one of the most commonly recognized triggers for yawning, boredom or a general lack of mental stimulation has also been associated with increased yawning frequency in some research, suggesting yawning may respond to a somewhat broader range of underlying triggers than simple physical fatigue alone. Yawning appears to activate a fairly widespread network of brain regions, rather than being controlled by a single, isolated area. Brain imaging studies examining yawning have found activity spread across multiple distinct brain regions during the behavior, rather than isolated activity confined to a single specific area, further reflecting the genuinely complex, multifaceted nature of what initially appears to be a very simple, ordinary physical reflex. Some researchers have proposed that yawning may help regulate the balance between different states of nervous system activity within the body. According to this particular theoretical framework, yawning may play a role in helping transition or balance activity between different branches of the nervous system responsible for regulating overall arousal, potentially explaining why yawning appears at such a wide variety of different physiological and emotional moments throughout an ordinary day. Yawning has occasionally been studied in relation to certain neurological conditions, given the behavior's clear connection to broader brain function and regulation. Because yawning involves coordinated activity across multiple brain regions responsible for automatic physiological regulation, researchers studying various neurological conditions have sometimes examined changes in yawning frequency or pattern as one small additional piece of a much larger overall clinical picture. The specific facial stretch involved in yawning may serve an additional function beyond any effect on the brain itself, potentially helping stretch and relax the jaw and facial muscles directly. Beyond any broader neurological or thermoregulatory function, the physical stretching involved in a full yawn may simply help relax tense jaw and facial muscles directly, offering a small, incidental physical benefit alongside whatever deeper underlying biological purpose the behavior ultimately serves. Some people report that yawning helps relieve mild tension headaches, potentially related to the same muscular stretching effect. While not a substitute for appropriate medical guidance regarding headaches, some individuals report a mild sense of relief following a yawn, possibly related to the temporary muscular release and increased blood flow associated with the behavior, an informal, anecdotal observation that remains only loosely connected to more rigorous scientific study. Yawning appears to occur in a fairly stereotyped, consistent pattern across nearly all instances, regardless of the individual or original triggering context. Despite arising in response to a wide variety of different situations, from tiredness to boredom to social contagion, the actual physical sequence of movements involved in yawning tends to remain remarkably consistent, suggesting the behavior itself is governed by a shared, deeply ingrained underlying neurological pattern. Some non-human primates display a particularly dramatic form of yawning, sometimes associated with displays of social status or dominance rather than tiredness. In certain primate species, exaggerated yawning displays, prominently showing off teeth, have been observed in specific social contexts related to establishing or reinforcing social hierarchy, suggesting yawning in these particular species may carry an additional layered social meaning well beyond any purely physiological function. Yawning in some animal species may also serve a role in visually communicating alertness or readiness to nearby group members. Beyond any potential role in synchronizing group rest periods, a visible yawn accompanied by a wide-open mouth may also serve as a simple visual signal to nearby animals, communicating a general state of readiness or alertness within a broader social group context. Yawning appears to occur with roughly similar overall frequency across men and women, based on the majority of available research. While individual yawning frequency naturally varies considerably from person to person, most research comparing yawning frequency between men and women generally has not found a dramatic or consistent overall difference between the two groups, suggesting yawning frequency is likely influenced more heavily by individual factors than by broad differences between sexes. Yawning has occasionally been studied in relation to seasonal patterns, given its apparent sensitivity to ambient temperature. Because yawning frequency appears to respond somewhat to surrounding air temperature according to the brain cooling theory, some researchers have explored whether yawning frequency shows any broader seasonal pattern, though this particular area remains considerably less studied compared to yawning's more well-established daily and sleep-related patterns. Some researchers have speculated that excessive screen time and associated eye strain could indirectly influence yawning frequency for some individuals, though this connection remains only loosely studied. Because eye strain and general fatigue can sometimes overlap in their underlying causes and associated symptoms, some researchers have speculated about a possible loose connection between prolonged screen use and increased yawning, though rigorous scientific evidence specifically confirming this particular relationship remains fairly limited so far. Yawning tends to become more frequent during long periods of monotonous, repetitive activity, even when a person is not otherwise particularly tired. Extended periods of low mental stimulation, such as a long, uneventful drive or a repetitive task, have been associated with increased yawning frequency in some studies, further reinforcing the idea that boredom and reduced mental engagement, not only tiredness, can meaningfully influence how often a person yawns. Some workplaces and driving safety programs specifically highlight increased yawning frequency as a potential early warning sign of dangerous driver fatigue. Because yawning frequency often increases noticeably alongside genuine physical tiredness, certain road safety awareness campaigns specifically highlight frequent yawning as one practical, easily noticeable warning sign that a driver may benefit from resting before continuing a long journey. Yawning is sometimes accompanied by a natural, involuntary stretching of the arms or body, a combined behavior researchers refer to as pandiculation. This broader, combined stretching and yawning behavior, observed across many animal species, is believed by some researchers to serve a shared underlying physiological function, potentially helping the body physically prepare for an upcoming shift in activity level, whether that shift involves settling into rest or transitioning toward more active movement. Pandiculation, the combination of yawning and full body stretching, is commonly observed in many animals immediately after waking from sleep. Watching a cat or dog wake from a nap often reveals the same combined stretching and yawning pattern, a widely shared behavior across many different animal species that appears closely tied to the physiological transition out of rest and into a more active, alert state. Some researchers believe pandiculation may help reset muscle tension and circulation throughout the body following an extended period of stillness. Beyond any specific connection to the brain or nervous system, the physical stretching involved in pandiculation may serve a simpler, more direct muscular and circulatory function, helping refresh blood flow and release residual muscle tension accumulated during a longer period of relative stillness or sleep. Yawning frequency in laboratory studies has sometimes been used as a general, indirect indicator of overall physiological arousal level. Because yawning appears connected to shifts in overall arousal, alertness, and nervous system activity, some researchers studying broader physiological states have used yawning frequency as one small, indirect measurable indicator among several others, rather than relying on yawning as a standalone, fully reliable measurement on its own. Yawning can sometimes occur in response to watching someone else simply talk or gesture about being tired, even without directly witnessing an actual yawn. Some studies on contagious yawning have found that even indirect cues associated with tiredness or yawning, rather than only a direct visual observation of another person's yawn, can occasionally be enough to trigger a yawn in someone nearby, further illustrating just how sensitive this particular contagious response can genuinely be. Some research suggests that simply thinking intently about yawning can be enough to trigger the behavior in many people, similar to reading or hearing about it. Much like reading a detailed written description of yawning has been shown to trigger yawning in many people, deliberately thinking about or focusing attention specifically on yawning has similarly been reported by many people as sufficient, on its own, to bring on an actual yawn shortly afterward. Yawning frequency can occasionally spike noticeably during long meetings, lectures, or other extended periods of sitting relatively still while listening. The specific combination of physical stillness, reduced mental stimulation, and often slightly warmer indoor environments common during long meetings or lectures may together help explain why yawning tends to become noticeably more frequent and more visibly contagious throughout a room during these particular kinds of extended, low-activity social situations. Some researchers have proposed that the specific timing of clustered yawns throughout the day may loosely align with natural dips in the body's broader circadian alertness rhythm. Because the body's overall alertness naturally fluctuates somewhat predictably throughout a typical day, some researchers have suggested that yawning frequency may loosely track these underlying circadian shifts, tending to increase somewhat during natural dips in alertness that occur at certain predictable points throughout an ordinary day. Yawning in premature infants has been studied by researchers interested in tracking early neurological development. Because yawning involves coordinated activity across multiple brain regions responsible for automatic regulation, some researchers studying premature infant development have examined yawning patterns as one small additional data point potentially relevant to tracking healthy early neurological development during this particularly sensitive early period of life. The muscles involved in a yawn include some of the same muscles used for chewing, swallowing, and speaking. Because yawning shares certain underlying muscular pathways with several other essential everyday functions involving the mouth and throat, some researchers believe yawning may serve an additional practical function related to periodically exercising and maintaining these shared muscle groups, alongside whatever deeper neurological or thermoregulatory purpose the behavior primarily serves. Yawning has occasionally been observed to synchronize loosely with breathing patterns and heart rate variability in some physiological studies. Some research measuring detailed physiological signals during yawning has found subtle, temporary shifts in breathing pattern and heart rate variability occurring around the same time, suggesting yawning may briefly, temporarily influence a somewhat broader range of physiological rhythms beyond simply the muscles directly involved in the yawn itself. Some researchers view yawning as an example of a fixed action pattern, a term describing a relatively automatic, largely unchanging behavioral sequence triggered reliably by specific conditions. Because the physical sequence of movements involved in yawning tends to remain so consistent regardless of the underlying trigger, some researchers classify it as an example of what is formally termed a fixed action pattern, a category of behavior well studied more broadly across animal behavioral science. Yawning appears to be one of the very few human behaviors that can be reliably and predictably triggered simply by discussing or reading about it, a genuinely unusual quality among ordinary human behaviors. Very few common human behaviors can be so reliably triggered purely through verbal or written description alone, making yawning a particularly interesting and unusual subject for researchers specifically interested in studying suggestion, contagion, and automatic behavioral triggers more broadly. Yawning has been the subject of scientific curiosity for centuries, with early theories dating back to ancient historical medical traditions. Long before modern neuroscience began exploring yawning in detail, ancient medical traditions in various cultures proposed their own early theories regarding the underlying purpose of yawning, reflecting a genuinely long historical thread of human curiosity surrounding this small, universally familiar, yet still only partially understood everyday behavior. Despite considerable modern research, scientists still do not have a single, fully agreed upon explanation covering every aspect of why humans and animals yawn. While the brain cooling theory currently holds considerable scientific support, alongside separate theories addressing social bonding, arousal regulation, and evolutionary group synchronization, researchers generally acknowledge that no single explanation currently accounts completely for every observed aspect of yawning behavior across every context and species studied so far. Yawning research continues to actively evolve, with new studies regularly refining or challenging previous assumptions about the behavior's true underlying purpose. As new research methods and technologies become available, scientists continue actively revisiting and refining earlier theories regarding yawning, meaning our collective scientific understanding of this small, seemingly simple everyday behavior will likely continue meaningfully developing and shifting well into the future. Some studies have examined yawning frequency in relation to overall body temperature regulation throughout an entire day, beyond simply its connection to ambient air temperature. Because body temperature naturally fluctuates somewhat predictably over the course of a day, some researchers have explored whether yawning frequency loosely tracks these internal temperature shifts as well, potentially offering additional support for the broader brain cooling theory of yawning function. Yawning may occasionally serve as a subtle nonverbal social cue among humans, communicating tiredness or reduced engagement without requiring any spoken words at all. Because yawning is so easily noticed and so reliably associated with tiredness or reduced attentiveness, it can function as an unintentional but genuinely informative nonverbal signal within social settings, occasionally prompting others nearby to suggest a break, change of activity, or simply acknowledge the moment. Some cultures have developed specific idioms or expressions directly referencing yawning to describe boredom or disengagement more broadly. Reflecting just how universally recognizable and relatable the behavior is, many languages and cultures have developed their own common expressions or idioms directly built around the concept of yawning, generally used to describe boredom, disinterest, or a lack of excitement in a given situation. Yawning appears to activate certain reward-related regions of the brain in some neuroimaging studies, offering a possible explanation for why a satisfying yawn can sometimes feel genuinely pleasant. Some brain imaging research examining yawning has found activity in regions loosely associated with reward and pleasant sensation, offering one possible explanation for the mildly satisfying feeling many people report experiencing immediately following a particularly full, complete yawn. Some researchers have explored whether yawning frequency differs measurably between introverted and extroverted individuals, though findings in this particular area remain limited and inconclusive. Given yawning's documented connection to social contagion and empathy, a small number of studies have explored whether broader personality traits might correlate with yawning frequency or contagious susceptibility, though current evidence in this specific area remains too limited to draw any firm, well-established conclusions. Yawning has occasionally been included as a small supporting measure within broader psychological studies examining social bonding and group cohesion. Because contagious yawning appears connected to empathy and social closeness, some researchers studying broader group dynamics and social bonding have occasionally included yawning contagion as one small additional supporting measure alongside other, more established methods of assessing social connection within a group. Some evidence suggests captive animals in zoos may yawn somewhat more frequently in certain conditions, potentially related to stress, boredom, or environmental factors within their enclosure. Researchers studying animal welfare in captive settings have occasionally examined yawning frequency as one small additional behavioral indicator potentially worth monitoring, alongside a range of other, more established welfare indicators used to assess an animal's overall well-being within its particular captive environment. Yawning frequency in domestic cats has been studied in relation to their broader daily activity and rest cycles. Because cats typically spend a considerable portion of each day resting or sleeping, researchers studying feline behavior have examined yawning as one small piece of the broader picture surrounding a cat's daily rhythm of activity, rest, and the transitions occurring between these two very different everyday states. Some researchers have proposed that yawning may have played a subtle role in early human social bonding around shared rest periods, long before recorded history began. Extending the broader group synchronization theory of yawning, some researchers have speculated that yawning may have contributed in some small way to coordinating rest periods among early human social groups, potentially offering a modest evolutionary advantage related to group safety and cohesion during vulnerable periods of rest. Yawning intensity can vary considerably from person to person, ranging from a small, barely noticeable partial yawn to a large, fully extended yawn involving the entire jaw, eyes, and upper body. Not every yawn looks or feels the same, and researchers studying yawning have noted this natural variation in intensity, though the underlying reasons why some yawns end up considerably more pronounced than others remain only loosely understood within current research. Some people report that a particularly satisfying, complete yawn can temporarily improve mental clarity or focus immediately afterward. Anecdotally, many people describe a brief sense of refreshed alertness following an especially full, complete yawn, an informal observation broadly consistent with the alertness-boosting theory some researchers have proposed, even though this particular subjective experience remains difficult to measure with full scientific precision. Yawning has occasionally appeared as a subject of interest within broader research on facial expression and nonverbal communication more generally. Because yawning involves such a distinctive, easily recognizable facial expression, researchers studying nonverbal communication and facial expression more broadly have sometimes included yawning within their wider analysis, given how reliably and universally recognizable the expression tends to be across different cultural and social contexts. Some researchers have examined whether yawning frequency changes measurably during pregnancy, given the wide range of physiological shifts pregnancy involves. Because pregnancy involves considerable hormonal and physiological change, a small body of research has explored whether yawning frequency shifts noticeably during this period, though findings so far remain limited and are generally considered only a minor, secondary area within the broader field of yawning research. Yawning has occasionally been referenced in discussions of workplace ergonomics and environmental design, given its documented sensitivity to room temperature and air quality. Because yawning frequency appears to respond somewhat to ambient temperature and possibly air quality more broadly, some workplace design discussions have referenced yawning patterns as one small, informal indicator potentially worth considering when evaluating overall indoor comfort and air circulation within shared office environments. Some evidence suggests yawning frequency may be influenced subtly by hydration levels, though this particular connection remains only loosely studied so far. A small amount of research and informal clinical observation has suggested a possible loose connection between hydration status and yawning frequency, though considerably more rigorous research would be needed before drawing any confident, well-established conclusions regarding this particular potential relationship. Yawning remains a genuinely active area of ongoing scientific curiosity, precisely because something so common and so universally familiar still holds so many unanswered questions. Perhaps more than almost any other everyday human behavior, yawning represents a striking example of how something experienced by nearly every person, many times a day, without a second thought, can still contain so much genuine, unresolved scientific mystery beneath its simple, familiar surface. As our journey through the quiet science of yawning comes to a close, perhaps this small, ordinary behavior feels a little less ordinary now. Not simply a sign of boredom or tiredness, but a small, coordinated physiological event tied to brain temperature, empathy, alertness, and a shared reflex stretching all the way back through evolutionary history to animals entirely unlike ourselves. We've drifted through fetuses yawning before birth, through yawns catching quietly between close friends, through dogs yawning back at the people who love them, through a behavior so universal it appears almost everywhere vertebrate life exists. And somewhere, right now, reading or listening to this quiet description, you may already feel the small, familiar pull of a yawn beginning to rise. Now you can let all of that drift softly into the background. Let your breathing slow. Let your shoulders loosen. Let the images fade from bright detail into something softer and more distant, like a long, slow breath finally released into a quiet, darkened room. And if you enjoyed this journey, perhaps you might like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps other curious minds find their way here, too, one quiet breath at a time. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another slow journey waiting for you on the screen, another gentle corner of the body and mind to drift into quietly. But for now, let your mind grow still, and let the day fall away. Sleep well, and good night.